Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell, recording live on Paddy's End, at least, from London town. How are we doing, Paddy? Give the people an update. We want to know how you're getting on in London.
I'm actually not in London town. I am in London City. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Disgusting, disgraceful. Anyway, yeah, London's good. It's good banter. It's definitely cheaper than Dublin. I know everyone fucking gasps when you say that. They're like, "Oh my god, London's so expensive." But if you live in Dublin, which is one of the most expensive places on the earth, everything appears cheap after that. You know, everything is just like, even like house prices. I was just like, casually looking at houses, even in London, and people are like, "Oh my god, London real estate so fucking expensive," and I was like, "Man, this is." Equivalent price to like where I'm from is like the edge of Dublin. Like I'm basically in Wicklow, and like the house prices there are the same as like equivalent houses in London. And I was like, this is very cheap, by comparison. You're like, this is London versus like basically Wicklow. So food is also much cheaper. So yeah, money stuff is fucking great over here. The life over here is good. Obviously, I know you guys still have masks and stuff over there. Like, there's none of that. There's no COVID restrictions, anything. Like, the most you have to do is wear your mask on the tube, which, probably want to wear that anyway, because people literally stand beside you with their fucking armpit in your face. Now, I'm taller than that, so it doesn't affect me, but my girlfriend says it's not an enjoyable experience. So yeah, life is good. I'm enjoying the move over. We're still getting some things sorted. We just got broadband sorted, which was actually a bit of a hassle. We're waiting on some fucking packages to be delivered, like our stuff from Ireland. But yeah, other than that, life is fucking good. How is it on your end, Gary?
Oh, absolutely fantastic. Loving life here in Irlande. I'm currently on urology placement, which is penis, testicles, ureters, kidneys. So good vibes, like, doing testicle exams and stuff. So it's fun living life. Where's the best place you've eaten so far in London?
Do women not have like urethras or anything, Gary?
No.
Nice.
It's pretty simple. Like, no, they don't. Women don't have urethras. Women don't actually go to the bathroom. I thought you knew that. Well, they might urinate every now and then, but women don't actually poo. I don't know if you knew that, but
I actually didn't know.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Or at least my girlfriend doesn't anyway. So where's the best place you've eaten? That's what I wanted to ask you.
I don't know.
That's the most important thing. Food
I put it on my
recommendation.
Instagram the other day. I'm basically just doing food reviews every time I eat somewhere.
Well, you wrecked one place. You said one place was a 6 or a 6.5 or something like that.
And to be honest, I wasn't great like that. That was in Seven Dials Market.
It looked decent. That was the burger.
It was definitely fine. Like you would eat it again, but you wouldn't be like, "Oh, you're made like you're coming over later in the year." I'm not going to be like, Gary,
let's go here.
You have to go here. Nah, like you wouldn't be doing that. Nah. The best place that I've eaten so far is Wingman's in Soho. That was actually fucking delicious. Would recommend. 11 out of 10. So there's my recommendations. However, I'll probably eat in like 200 more places in the next year. So
we'll keep the folks updated.
Yeah, exactly.
Are these all vegan restaurants you're eating at?
No, I exclusively eat insect meat, so only insect protein.
Nice insect burgers. We respect it. So with that said, we're going to talk today about the cardiovascular system, and in particular, training as it pertains to the cardiovascular system, or if you're a nerd who's very pedantic, the cardiorespiratory system. Okay, so we're going to talk about principles of programming, or I guess why you would introduce cardio to your program, because what we've been doing over the last while, if you've been listening, is we've been talking about the principles of training, and we've been talking about why you would increase volume, decrease volume, is periodization important, etc. In the last episode, we discussed strength with our strength coach Shane, strong guy, great calves, and he was discussing powerlifting and how we could get as strong as possible. So in this episode, what we're going to discuss is how can you get fit? How can you get fit alongside your strength training? And I guess the inevitable question that always comes up, is cardio going to destroy the gains that you get along that process? So are you happy with that, Paddy? Is that what we're covering?
100%. And I should also make a note that we have actually done an entire series on cardio. So this is going to be basically just a little bit of a rehash of that, but also just, dive into a few particular points. Like we're not going to, do a huge deep dive on like, what is aerobic conditioning? What is anaerobic conditioning? Like, yes, we'll mention those things, but it's not going to be a deep dive, right? We've already done a cardio series. I don't know what episodes it is. I probably should have looked that up beforehand, but you can go back, you can look at our feed, you can type in, cardio triage method. It'll probably come up on whatever podcast platform you use. So do have a listen to that if you want a more in-depth discussion. However, this episode in particular is going to be a little bit more practical because, as Gary said, we have been discussing like, how do you design a training program, right? And we've basically focused on resistance training up to this point, and that's fine. We both have a resistance training bias, I would say. Like, I think it's pretty fantastic for a whole host of goals. And, I would be hard pressed to find a population that I would say, you know what, you shouldn't resistance train, right? I don't know if you can think of one off the top of your head. So with that in mind, we're always going to recommend resistance training.
There is one population, and that is those of us, including myself and yourself, actually, who are actually, it's a bit sad to say, but, resistant to hypertrophy training. We unfortunately don't actually adapt to training. So.
Resistance training non-responders. Yeah.
Non-responders would be the term. Yeah. So
in that case, maybe don't resistance train. It's just going to be a disappointing endeavor, just like my, course of trying to grow calves. It's been a disappointing endeavor.
We do it for psychological, character building, really, just to see, can we keep training for 10, 20 years without making any progress and just stay in the game. So it's just character building.
Is that why you do it? No, I do it just to troll everyone, where they see this little skinny guy and then you're like, fuck, is he literally squatting over 200 kilos?
Yeah, but see, you are a strength responder, but I'm also a strength non-responder, strength and hypertrophy non-responder. So
sorry. Well, that's not me anyway. So I suppose that's where we differ, But anyway, if we're hard pressed to find population that shouldn't resistance train, right? So most people should do some form of resistance training. Again, we've talked an entire podcast series about why that's a good idea, and injury prevention, building muscle, body composition, et cetera, right? But cardiovascular training, now you can fall into two camps with this. You can be someone that falls into the camp of, oh, all I do is cardiovascular training and they don't do any resistance training. And the opposite camp is, all I do is resistance training and I do no cardiovascular training. And realistically, both of those camps are probably fucking wrong, right? And I hate to say that because, I like when people train. I think it's a good idea to train. And if you find a modality, that you enjoy, have at it. However, you probably are missing out on some adaptations, some health adaptations, and just physical adaptations that could be of benefit for you if you were to do a little bit of both, at least to some degree, right? So that's what we kind of want to discuss today. Like, how do we integrate some cardio work into a resistance training program, right? Is it just a case of, oh, this is what we do for cardio work, so I'm just going to add that onto resistance training, like, oh, I want to train for a marathon, but I also train 5 days per week in the gym. Do I just add on marathon training? Again, probably not a great idea, right? So how do we actually integrate cardiovascular goals and resistance training goals, right? Well, the basics of it is, it comes down to, first of all, understanding the adaptations that we're trying to elicit, right? And again, we've covered this more in depth in previous podcasts and entire podcast series. So go back and listen to that if you want more in-depth stuff. But we can basically say that we have two. Now, this is a bit of a simplification, but we can basically say that there's two systems that we want to target with cardiovascular training. And that is the aerobic system and the anaerobic system, right? And these are just energy systems. An aerobic system, or the aerobic system, not an aerobic system. The aerobic system basically means that it is the system, the energy utilization system, that is being used when oxygen is present, right? So it requires oxygen to work, right? And as a result of that, you kind of can't be at a pace that doesn't allow you to breathe, right? Very simplified way of thinking about it. Like, if you're like gasping for air, you can pretty much guarantee that you're not getting oxygen into your body. Well, you are getting some, but you're not getting enough oxygen into your body to allow the aerobic system to work at full capacity, right? And the converse is true. We have the anaerobic system, which works, without oxygen. Now, that's not completely true because the aerobic system restocks the anaerobic system, the substrates used, and a few different things. So they are both, in tandem. They do work together, but the anaerobic system basically works without oxygen, right? So this is the stuff that gets your heart rate a lot higher, right? We can use heart rate as a bit of a guide because that also, like Gary said earlier on, it is technically the cardiorespiratory system, and we can kind of look at those two things in tandem. So if your heart rate is getting really, really elevated, that probably means that your breathing is also getting really, really elevated, and you're like you're taking shallower breaths generally, but you're taking quicker breaths, right? And that generally doesn't allow as much oxygen to get into the bloodstream. Like it technically does. It's a nice adaptation to allow you to get sufficient exchange going on, so that you can get rid of some of the carbon dioxide and get some more quote unquote good air into your lungs, right? So we have these two systems. Generally speaking, the aerobic system responds well to, we'll call it stuff in the below 140 beats per minute range, right? So heartbeats per minute, right? And then the anaerobic system responds well to higher intensity stuff, higher heart rates, right? But we can look at it from the heart rate perspective, and we can also look at it from the actual, we'll call it the energy, the bioenergetics, I suppose, and the time course of that. And what happens is, really, because we don't have enough oxygen, the anaerobic system is really only good for about 2 minutes, right? After 2 minutes, and obviously as you get closer to the 2 minutes, that kind of starts getting, we'll call it worse. It's not as effective. It's not as an effective energy source. And this is why you can't sprint for 5 minutes. You can't just like, oh, I'm going to run as fast as I possibly can for 5 minutes, right? You kind of get to the end of your anaerobic ability, and that might be 90 seconds, it might be 2 minutes, where you start really noticing this drop off, right? So within that 0 to 2 minutes, you're kind of using the anaerobic system. However, the aerobic system is still being used at that time. And after that kind of, we'll say 30, 40, 50, 60 seconds, you start getting more and more aerobic utilization. And again, this is why your performance in terms of a sprint kind of dips down after that, Like this is why you can sprint. You can sprint for like 10 seconds and you're fucking golden. Like there's, that's handy. That's because that's actually the alactic system, or the creatine phosphate, or no, what's the thing? What's the name of it?
ATP phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate.
Yes, I knew it was creatine phosphate. The ATP VCR system, right? So, you're actually not really even tapping into the anaerobic system then. Like you are obviously tapping into it a little bit, but you're basically just using, we'll call it free floating energy for that system. It doesn't have to actually do any metabolism to break down glucose to start fueling these other systems, right? So that's something to be aware of, that we basically have a time course, and then we also have heart rate zones that we can use, right? And that actually allows us to program this stuff, right? So would you say that's enough information just to kind of start this all off in terms of understanding the different adaptations, well, it's not all the adaptations to cardiovascular training? If we understand, okay, we've got this aerobic system and we've got this anaerobic system, and we can use heart rate and we can use time course to start programming that stuff, right? Is that enough so far? Because we haven't really touched on the adaptations that you actually get in terms of like, why would you do cardio? So what are your thoughts so far, Gary?
Yeah, I think that's all pretty accurate. And I think one of the, I guess, similar analogies that came to mind as you were speaking is that, so like recently I got a car. Okay, started driving, and it's a hybrid. So that means that you've got access to an electric engine. You've also got access to your petrol engine. Okay, so in that case, what's really readily accessible in a hybrid car is the electric engine. So it kicks in like immediately. It's like your readily available energy, but it also runs out quite quick because it's a hybrid. You have to charge it up again. It doesn't last as long as my full tank of petrol would. And that's actually very similar to what Paddy was saying here in terms of the freely available energy of the ATP creatine phosphate system. So you can think of this as like your short term, like it's going to kick in really quickly if you need it immediately. And that's what happens with a hybrid vehicle. But that doesn't mean the electric can't contribute when you're going at a steady state. It can. And that's similar to if you're walking around. It doesn't mean like if you're walking around or you're doing a very light jog, it's not like you're not accessing energy from the phosphocreatine system. You absolutely are, but it's just not the sole provider or the primary provider. It's just there. Everything's kind of working together. And that's always the case with energy systems. They're always contributing together. It's the relative contribution that varies depending on the type of activity that you're doing. And then in terms of like, if you stick with, I guess, the car analogy, what you can think about is if you're driving your car at like a steady pace and you're not accelerating at all, if you have a really powerful engine, let's say you're driving a 2021 BMW versus like a 2003 Suzuki or something, if you're driving at 100 kilometers an hour, the Suzuki is going to sound like it's straining a lot, at 100 kilometers an hour, it's difficult for it to maintain that. Whereas if you're in one of the newer cars with a larger engine, it barely sounds like it's moving. And that's a very similar case with exercise. If you've got a well-trained runner that's running at a 5-minute per kilometer pace, let's say, that's really easy for them. They can maintain that. They can maintain conversation. There's no signs of strain. Whereas if you've got someone that's unfit running at that and trying to maintain it, they're going to sound like they're really straining, and it's a difficult thing for them to maintain. And that's basically them being at the higher end of their energy system contribution. So rather than them being able to maintain it aerobically, like the really fit person would, they have to dip into more of those anaerobic contributions. And the thing is that's going to, fatigue quicker. That's going to be less efficient, much like if you're, have the car up to the max RPMs, you're really pushing the engine, that's going to be less efficient than if you're just kind of cruising along. So you can think of it there if you're an automobile head, I think it's easy to understand though. It is kind of similar.
Yeah, it's quite.
I was just going to say, like, the actual principles are the same. I think that's the interesting thing. If you're into like, chemistry, whether it's the petrochemicals or whatever, or metabolism, the fundamental principles are the same. We're still just creating energy. It's still just physics at the end of the day. So the same.
We're creating energy, are we?
Oh. Sorry.
Creating energy. Fuck's sake. We're transferring energy. Anyway.
I create energy.
Oh, yes. I forgot you were Sol Invictus. You were the bringer of light.
That is me.
Anyway, so that's the basics of the two systems. Now, why might we bring in some cardio? Well, of course, it makes life easier. If you were fitter, the tasks that you are doing are going to be less fatiguing, as Gary said, right? You go to walk down to the shops, you're huffing and puffing and you're out of breath. Like that's not going to be an enjoyable experience. So if you're fitter, daily life is easier, right? But also in the context of resistance training, because again, we're talking about how do we integrate the two of these, it actually allows you to do more volume. You're actually fitter to do the work in the gym. Because think about it, if you are doing something that, say, you're doing a heavy set of 8, on squats or something, you're going to be a little bit fatigued after that. And not just fatigued in the muscles used, fatigued in the cardiorespiratory system, right? So if you have a better cardiorespiratory system, you're probably going to be able to recover between sets a little bit quicker, right? So it makes your gym work a little bit more efficient. Perhaps you can get more volume as a result, and potentially you can get more hypertrophy as a result of that, right? Now, it also helps with health, as we've discussed many times. You can have a lower heart rate, lower resting heart rate is probably one of the biggest indicators of health that I can think of, at least that is at least trainable, as at least like something that we can influence very readily. Like obviously there's other things that are big indicators of health, but this is something that is actually trainable. It's actually very easy to, I shouldn't say easy, it's actually very easy to manipulate, I suppose. So it is something that we should be looking at. If you have a lower resting heart rate, something below 60 beats per annum, that means that your heart is doing less work at quote unquote rest, and again, it's making your life easier, but also that means that your heart has a potential for a longer lifespan. Obviously organs and stuff, they do have the capacity to, quote unquote heal or, fix themselves. So it's not the exact same analogy, but again, imagine you're putting fucking 200 kilometers onto your car every single day, which say, you've got 200,000 fucking heartbeats in a week. I don't know how many fucking it is. I don't know the maths. You know, if you're doing less heartbeats for a same given task as someone else, then you're putting less wear and tear on the system, right? Now, again, that's not the perfect analogy for a human system because, again, we do adapt, but it does have some merit, right? So that is something that we want to be aware of. You're actually making yourself healthier by doing some cardiovascular conditioning. And again, if the goal is to build more muscle, build more strength, have better body composition, etc., like we want to be able to do this stuff for a long time. It's not just a case of, oh, I want to be able to do this stuff for the next 2 years, get as jacked as possible, and then die of a heart attack. You know, that's obviously not the goal for most people, at least, right? So cardio is going to be really beneficial for that. Now, the issue that we run into is how do we actually integrate the two of these things? How do we actually integrate cardiovascular conditioning and resistance training, right? Because they actually do activate two, we'll call them dichotomous systems, right? Like resistance training, it basically leads to a situation where you have more activation of, we'll call it this protein, mTOR, right? And it used to be called mammalian target of rhabdomyosin, but now it's called mechanistic target of rhabdomyosin, right? So we have this mTOR, and that mTOR is responsible to an extent for signaling the cascade, or as part of the signaling cascade, I should say, that leads to muscle building, right? So we want to have that if we're trying to build some muscle. It also, you know, we'll call it an anabolic signaling pathway here, right? You can kind of think of it like that, right? So resistance training and protein intake, especially leucine, and does lead to increases in this signaling cascade, increases in this muscle building. Fantastic, right? The opposite system to this is the kind of, we'll call it the AMPK system, right? There's other names for it. You can think of it in terms of different things, but let's just call it the AMPK system, right? And that system is kind of antagonistic. It shuts off this mTOR system, right? Cardiovascular conditioning leads to more activation of this AMPK system, right? And that's good from the perspective that once we activate that AMPK system, we do actually get increases in like mitochondrial biogenesis. We get increases in angiogenesis, so more blood cell, or what's the fucking word? Veins, whatever, you know, blood vessels is the word I'm looking for. You know, we actually get more blood vessels going to different muscles, going to, you know, the areas that we need it, so that you can get more oxygen into the working muscles. Because again, think about it, we need this cardiorespiratory system. Your blood is what transports all this stuff around your body, right? So when we're doing cardio, we're actually getting more activation of this AMPK system, right? Which unfortunately shuts off this muscle building system, right? So from a mechanistic standpoint, you could understand and go, Jesus Christ, if I do cardio, that means that I'm limiting my muscle building, right? Because it shuts off this other system, right? The unfortunate thing about that, as a very simplistic understanding, is that resistance training does actually activate the AMPK system once you're doing it, right? The mTOR system, or the, you know, muscle building system, doesn't actually kick in until, you know, 30 minutes, 90 minutes, 2 hours after your workout, right? So during your workout, you are technically, we'll call it catabolic. You are breaking down, right? The exact same way you are breaking down when you do cardiovascular conditioning, right? However, after resistance training, we then get the signal to rebuild. We get the signal to build from this mTOR, right? So that is something to be aware of, that you're not like cardio or resistance training does actually activate AMPK as well, right? It's not just like, oh, as soon as I do like cardio, I get AMPK, and as soon as I do resistance training, I get mTOR. That's not as simplistic as it initially seems. There is a lot more going on with this, right? But it does bear keeping in mind that there is some sort of interference if we're trying to hammer both of these systems at the same time, right? And this is one of those reasons that you don't see, you know, huge jacked marathon runners, because the amount of volume that they have to do for marathon running, it leads to a situation where they're not actually able to build muscle as effectively, right? However, you have to also factor in that marathon running, it behooves you to be lighter. Building more muscle above and beyond what you actually need, it doesn't help you with your sport, right? So we have to factor that in as well, right? But also we have to factor in the fact that you also see a lot of people that do a lot of cardiovascular conditioning and are jacked out of their mind, right? Look at CrossFit athletes, right? Jacked. Now, huge amount of anabolic steroid use, but they're jacked, right? you can see strongman competitors, again, jacked. They do a lot of cardio as well because they have to be fit for their competition, right? You know, rugby players, football players, you know, like the different, like I meant American football players, I should say there. Now you see a lot of people that do conditioning work, resistance training work, and they're jacked and they're fit. So it's not like there's this dichotomous like either or. As soon as you do any conditioning, you're trying to build muscle, boom, it's gone. It's off the tables, right? It's off the cards. It's not happening. That's not how it works. You can do both, right? The thing is, how do we actually integrate like a program? Like how do we integrate the two of them together into an effective program, right? So do you have anything else to add on to that, Gary, before we actually get into kind of more of the integration stuff?
Yeah, so I suppose like one thing that I would add on there is that a lot of people, when they're focused on the resistance training side of things, just building muscle, building strength, they can be quite concerned initially when they're adding in that cardio, because even if they don't think, all right, it's not going to interfere, let's say, in terms of like the cellular pathways, what they might feel is, well, it's going to take away from my recovery from weight training, etc. And I had an anecdote from a client this week who reached out to me and said, you know, he's feeling like he is able to recover so much better in his sessions and between his sessions, and in particular within the session, that he's not getting as short of breath during his resistance training sets. And this is something we see quite frequently with people who, especially those who have a long weight training background or history, but don't have a solid base of cardiorespiratory fitness. That can be a deficit for them, because they're not able to handle as much training, because it's actually the ability to, you know, produce that energy during exercise that is the limiting factor, especially for sets of 8, 10, 12, 15, 20 plus. You're going to be limited there, not necessarily by your muscular strength, but by your ability to provide that energy in time. And if you've got better cardiorespiratory fitness, that can actually support your weight training performance and potentially increase the gains that you get in return. Now, there's not much evidence on that, because obviously this is very individual specific. Like, I wouldn't expect, for me, I've got a good level of fitness, so I don't expect that adding in more cardio is ever going to improve my weight training. It would be way better for me to do more weight training. But for someone who has a bodybuilding background, they get short of breath quite quickly, and it takes them ages to recover between sets. That individual, they could certainly benefit from, you know, being
Probably
more
a better
fit.
example would be a power lifter, you know,
Yeah,
when they're literally struggling to get over 5 reps.
100%.
Like a classic case where you're like, okay, you could actually definitely benefit from more cardiovascular conditioning would be a power lifter who needs to move up a weight class, right? They need to move up a weight class and they struggle to do over 5 reps, right? So they're not able to, you know, build sufficient amounts of volume because, first of all, they're really conditioned towards only doing 5 reps. But if they try to do more, it's their lungs that are on fire. It's not really the muscles, right? So in that case, doing more cardiovascular conditioning is actually going to put them in a position where they can actually do more resistance training, recover from that resistance training, and then as a result of that, get into the next weight class up, which is kind of something that you wouldn't necessarily think of, because a lot of people think of cardio purely from the perspective of burning calories. That's it, right? And we will touch on that in a second in terms of using cardio to effectively burn some calories, right? But yeah, like I've had loads of clients in that same kind of position where you're like, oh, you know, I actually started bringing in some more cardio, and all of a sudden I'm actually able to get better results. I'm able to recover from training better. My sleep is improved, et cetera, et cetera. And as we said, like if you've got a lower resting heart rate throughout the day, like life is just easier, you know? So obviously recovery is going to be better for someone whose life is just easier. It's a less stressful endeavor to just walk across the room. Like if you walk across the room and you look at your, like, you know, heart rate tracking watch and it's like 120 beats per minute, like you are probably unfit. Like I walk across the room and my heart rate is 45, you know? So you have to put that in context in terms of, okay, well, if mine is 45 and yours is literally 120 doing the exact same activity, who do you think is going to be more fatigued from that activity? Of course, it's the person that basically got into fucking proper cardiovascular or aerobic conditioning territory just walking across the room, you know? So that's something to take into account, right? But I mean, like, as I said, like we recovered all this stuff in the more in-depth podcast series already. So let's move on. Let's actually integrate this stuff. Let's actually put this together, right? so you follow along the last series, or this series, I should say. You're like, okay, I understand pretty well in terms of how I'm going to design my resistance training stuff, right? I'm like, okay, I'm going to choose these exercises. I've really, dialed in on my goal. I've got all that sorted, right? But I want to bring in some cardiovascular conditioning because I want to be fit. I understand that it's a good thing to have, a good thing to do to keep myself healthy long term. So how do we actually integrate this stuff? And it's actually quite straightforward, because we can look at this in terms of, we'll just call it intensity levels, right? And the first thing we want to do to bring in some cardiovascular conditioning is to bring in background cardiovascular conditioning. And what I mean by this is just bring your steps or your general like non-exercise activity thermogenesis to a good place, right? Doesn't need to be hugely fatiguing. Again, like if it's just neat, you're basically just walking around a bit more, it's probably not all that fatiguing, right? But it does lead to some sort of cardiovascular conditioning. It does lead to some cardiovascular adaptations that lead you to a position where you have better health, right? It also encourages blood flow. So it actually probably makes your current resistance training a little bit easier to recover from, rather than just having that kind of, we'll call it quote unquote stagnant blood, right? Obviously your blood is pumping around your body, but what I mean by that is you're not actually getting it, deep into the muscle, we'll say, right? Because there's no need to, because you're not actually using those muscles. So let's say you train legs in the morning and then you go for a walk later that day, you're probably going to have better recovery the day after that, because you've got increased oxygenation, you've got increased like blood flow, you've got increased nutrient delivery to those muscles, right? So fantastic. We bring in some light, low-level cardio. That's the first step. Would you agree with that in terms of that being your first intervention? You have someone, they've never done any cardiovascular conditioning. It's, I know, a 40-year-old, 50-year-old, they've got their resistance training down. They're like, I'm training 3 to 4 days per week. What's the next step? I want to get cardiovascularly fitter. Where do you start?
Absolutely. I think that that's such a basic thing that sticks with you for life. Then I think that's one of the big benefits there, is that if you can start to build a habit of just walking more every day, then that sticks with you independent of your environment, which is really important, because it means that, maybe you'll move jobs and you're not able to access a gym for a certain period of time, so you're not getting any training in. If you've built up that habit of getting out for walks regularly and keeping your steps up, it'll stick with you. So that's something that's really positive from a health perspective. Now, the one exception to that would be if someone is already using up a lot of their um, kind of free time in the gym, and they don't really have time or the opportunity to increase their steps, whether it be due to work commitments or whatever it happens to be. Then for that individual, I would consider just going straight to cardio and kind of skipping increasing steps. Like maybe they're at 5,000-6,000 and it's just not practical for them to get further than that at the moment. Then maybe adding in, 10-15 minutes of like, harder cardio at the end of a session might be applicable. But for most people, you should think of it in terms of that kind of pyramid where your base is just being active throughout the day. Again, less of a priority if you're someone at the very high threshold of training already. Like, for example, if you're doing 4 jiu-jitsu sessions per week and you're doing, 4 resistance training sessions per week, you're already doing 8 weight training sessions and you're doing 5,000-6,000 steps. Like getting higher than that, like there's a lower return on investment than if someone was sedentary.
100%. So again, baseline activity, that's the starting point. Cool, we've got that, right? The next thing in my mind, what I generally like people to do is have some sort of baseline level of aerobic conditioning. Like, I don't think we should be bringing in this really high intensity conditioning if your heart rate is, you struggle to use the aerobic system effectively, right? Now, there's 2 trains of thought on this, especially because the higher intensity stuff is a little bit more time efficient. So I'm not like hard and fast with this. I'm not going to be like, this is the way we have to do it. However, if we have someone that has the time, I'm probably going to start with aerobic conditioning, right? Now, the unfortunate thing about aerobic conditioning is it kind of takes a little bit of time. It kind of takes a little bit of a longer period of time of actively doing it to actually build the adaptations that we want. You kind of have to be doing cardiovascular, like aerobic conditioning for 30 plus minutes to kind of get we'll call it the left ventricle, the heart adaptations that we want, right? Now, obviously, if you're very unconditioned, you've never done any kind of cardiovascular conditioning, you're probably getting those benefits from like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, cool, right? But if we have someone that's, they've started to actually really adapt to this stuff, they're in a good position, they're kind of, they want to get fitter, and they're not, hugely out of shape, we probably want to bring in some actual like direct cardiovascular, longer, low intensity cardiovascular conditioning. And in my mind, what I just do is like, okay, let's say we have 3 to 4 resistance training sessions. You can do this 2 ways. You can add in like 15 minutes of low intensity cardio at the end of those sessions. That's not my preferred way. My preferred way is to just do a longer activity at the weekend, right? Now, this can be formal cardio in terms of we're going to sit on a treadmill, sit on a bike, stand on a treadmill, go on a stepper, whatever. We're going to do that for 30 to 90 minutes, right? And we're going to keep our heart rate somewhere in the range of 120 to 140 beats per minute, right? That's roughly a kind of pace where you could hold a conversation, but not have an in-depth conversation. Like you can just about talk at that level. You're able to hold a conversation, but someone would know you're exercising, right? That would be my preferred way. Now, again, that doesn't have to be formal in terms of going to the gym. This could be, I'm actually going to go for a 90-minute walk, or maybe a slight jog, or I'm going to go for a hike, or I'm going to do something that's active. I'm going to go for a swim. I'm going to do something that gets my heart rate up, and it's somewhere around that 120, 140 beats per minute. Now, obviously, that's dependent on your environment, whatever. Like, I'm not going to go for a 90-minute hike, and I'm in London. Like, where the fuck am I going to go for a hike, So it has to be obviously put into perspective of your own life, your own situation, etc. But 30 to 90 minutes of getting your heart rate elevated is probably going to be my next intervention there. Now, obviously, we have to factor in time commitments. Like if you're doing 4 resistance training sessions already, and then I say, oh yeah, we have to layer on a 90-minute session as well, and you're kind of like, I don't actually have the fucking time for that. It is what it is. So then we're going to have to look at something else. But would that be your next intervention, Gary? Getting someone to do some more aerobic conditioning? Would that be where you'd go next?
Yeah, I think it's a really easy thing to introduce for people too, because I think this is a point I find to be very educational for a lot of clients, where they've done cardio in the past, but anytime they've done it, they've basically just tried to go as hard as they can for that period of time. And the most common one is you see people on the step or the stair mill, what's he got, Stairmaster, and they are doing 30 minutes or 45 minutes, and they're just gasping for breath throughout, and it's just hell. And you don't want to go and do that again, because you're talking about trying to maintain 160, 170, 180 plus beats per minute for 30 to 60 minutes. And that's just really uncomfortable, not nice. And that definitely is going to dig into your weight training recovery, like way more than just the aerobic stuff. Whereas when I tell clients that to slow it down, keep to like 130 to 150, maybe beats per minute, somewhere around there, and they're able to, just breathe comfortably. They can, use their phone and change the song they're listening to or whatever without having to just gasp all the time. That's a lot more comfortable. And it's something that's very easy to implement then, because you're able to recover from it quickly. There's not the same anxiety going into the session. You don't have to hype yourself up for a session like that. You can very easily do it after a weight training session. And it's also the type of thing that you can comfortably listen to a podcast or audiobook while doing. If you're trying to push yourself, like that person on the Stairmaster at holding 170 beats per minute, you might need some more motivational music, and you're trying to, hype yourself up and everything. And all of that actually contributes to the fatigue that you get from a training session, the anxiety before, the fatigue during, and the recovery demands after. So the more casual you can make this, just casually listening to a podcast, sticking with it for 30 to 45 minutes, maybe 60 minutes at 140 beats per minute, it's quite a positive exercise experience. You generally feel better after it than if you were doing a really hard session, because after a really hard session, you feel beat up. Whereas this, it's somewhat restorative, still challenging, but should feel somewhat restorative.
Yeah, 100%. And that is why I like it.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, again, time constraints. The next thing then, if I'm like, look, you've got this, you've adapted to this, you've got aerobic base now, we're in a good position, right? The next thing I would bring in is some more higher intensity stuff, right? Because we can get some nice adaptations from that. And especially if you're already doing resistance training, this gives us an opportunity to add on, 5 to 10 minutes of higher intensity anaerobic stuff at the end of your sessions, right? Now, the thing is, we do have to still be aware of fatigue. We do still have to be aware of the fact that this is going to probably impact your recovery, especially initially until you adapt to it. But if we bring in 5 to 10 minutes of anaerobic conditioning, so we'll call them like sprint intervals at the end of your resistance training sessions, you can be in a great position in terms of you've pretty much knocked out all of your cardiovascular conditioning, all the adaptations you can get. Now, are you going to be the best marathon runner? Are you going to be the best sprinter, etc.? No, because we're adding cardio in. It's not the main focal point of the program, right? So the way I usually do it is, there's a few different, we'll call them protocols you can use, but basically we want to do something that has us doing a work period for, depending on what exact adaptations we're trying to get, somewhere in the range of 10 to 120 seconds of work. And then we probably want to have, like, I personally, if I'm doing anaerobic stuff at the end of a resistance training session, I generally like a kind of 3 to 6 to 1 ratio of rest to work, right? So if I'm doing a 10-second interval, I'll probably have at least a 50-second rest period. And I generally like a little bit of active rest, so we're not just like, boom, static, stop. If I'm doing something like 30 seconds, then I like at least 90 seconds of rest for that. Now, again, it depends on the conditioning of the individual. And if we're doing something like, 2 minutes of hard work, we're probably looking at least call it 3 to 6 minutes of rest. So that doesn't really lend itself to doing that at the end of your resistance training sessions, because you basically 2 minutes of hard work, 3 minutes of recovery. You can do that once, twice, and it's not a really beneficial strategy, right? So I generally prefer the kind of shorter intervals, somewhere in the range of 10 to 50 seconds for the kind of sprints. And generally it's usually below 30. And I'm trying to get people to beat their record in terms of how hard they are pushing with those intervals, especially if you have something that can track it, such as like watts or calories per hour or whatever it is, right? And that's generally what I like. And I get that, whatever the intervals are, make that add up to about 5 minutes. We're done. That could be 3 intervals in total, 5 intervals, whatever it is, depending on the exact protocol, and kind of call it good then, right? So you've added in some anaerobic conditioning. Now, obviously, if you're only doing 10 seconds, it's a bit more of that kind of alactic system that we talked about. But even still, it's more of that kind of getting the lacking of oxygen energy system working, right? And that can be fantastic for really improving your conditioning. Now, there is another way that you can do this, which is very fatiguing, but it can be quite effective. And that is to use really, really incomplete rest periods, right? So something like a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 rest to work ratio. So you might do, again, a 30-second interval, and you might only do a 30-second recovery, right? Or a 30-second interval and a 60-second recovery. And you do that knowing that, your performance is going to decrease as the reps go on. And you're doing that so that you can, first of all, burn a little bit more calories, you would hope, but also so that you can kind of really, really push the strain, that kind of the higher heart rate zone. And the thing about this is, it actually becomes more aerobic. The longer you leave that, like, you can't just, again, sprint for 5 minutes. So if you're doing a 5-minute, quote unquote, anaerobic, session where you're doing a 1-to-1 work to rest period, like, by about 2 minutes, that's just becoming more and more aerobic. It just is what it is, right? Because you're not actually able to get the heart rate back down. You're not able, it's not like, your work period, you're getting up to like 180 beats per minute. And then your rest period, you're coming straight back down to 120. Like, that's not happening for most people, even the most conditioned of the conditioned people out there. Like, you're probably not getting that kind of recovery in a 30-second window, right? So it's going to become more aerobic, even though your heart rate is more elevated. And what will happen then is you'll kind of just start noticing your performance decrease, that top end performance. Like, again, if we're using something like watts for output, we're like, okay, cool, I want you to get, 2,000 watts on this machine. And you notice, okay, the first sprint I did 2,000, the next one I did 1,800, and the next one I did, 1,400. That's probably the way it's going to go, because, you've basically used up all of the glycogen that's freely accessible at that point, and then you're moving more into this kind of aerobic metabolism. So would that be the way you would go about it, Gary? Add in some sort of anaerobic conditioning at the end of your workout?
Yeah, I'm a fan. I'm a big fan. And like you said, like the ideal is to be able to maintain a slightly longer rest to work ratio than most people do. Like a lot of people when they implement this, they'll do like 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off kind of thing, or even the other way around, they'll go like 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off or whatever. And that's fine in some cases. But I think for the most part, if you're trying to really get the most out of those work intervals, you want to be, at least going with a 2 or 3 times rest to work ratio. Obviously, that varies then depending on the duration of the work period and what you're doing, of course. But I think for the most part, it should be easy enough to get a decent stimulus within maybe 15 minutes or so after your workout. If you use that type of work to rest period, for example, you're doing, 30 seconds, let's say, and then you rest for 60 to 90 seconds, and then you repeat that, whatever, 5 rounds or whatever. That's, a decent amount of training to get in after your session. Longer sessions, if they're approaching 30 minutes and beyond and you're really pushing yourself hard, I would do them on their own. Generally, I encourage clients to do that. In some cases, I'm happy for them to do them after their sessions, but generally as well, if I'm having someone do really hard intervals that are approaching 30 minutes and beyond, there's generally a specific purpose. So, for example, they might be a GA athlete, field sports athlete of some sort, maybe martial arts. Like, there's generally a purpose. So, I would have that as a specific session. Or maybe it might be that they have light upper body work to do and then they do that interval type session. But anything less than, 30 minutes, if it's 15 to 20, 10 to 20, I think that should be achievable after a session. Just think about the crossover between the muscles that you're using there too. So it's obviously going to be superior for most types of intervals to do it after an upper body session than to do it after a really hard lower body session where you've already emptied the tank. Most people won't have much left in the tank after a really hard leg session. So that's something to keep in mind. And also then just in terms of the modalities that you're using, it's important for hard intervals, I generally try to choose low impact options with primarily concentric effort. And what I mean by that is that things like cycling, assault bike, etc., they're all primarily concentric activities because you're doing the shortening phase, but you don't have a lot of force to absorb on impact or on the lengthening phase. Whereas with running, if you're doing hard sprints, that's super fatiguing. And if you're doing a 20-minute sprint session, especially if you're not an athlete who has trained sprints before, you're going to be so sore, probably even sore than you will be after your leg sessions. So choosing those concentric activities where possible would be my advice.
Yeah, because you kind of do forget that one of the functions of muscles is to absorb like the
Yeah,
shock or whatever you want to call it, the forces that your body is
yeah,
exposed to. And so like and you definitely notice this. If you try to run downhill, like your quads are gonna be fucking beat the fuck up the
yeah.
next day, because they're absorbing all that braking force,
And it actually feels easy at the time. That's the thing with downhill, especially. And then the day after, you just goosed.
Yeah, you're just like, fuck, I didn't realize my quad could feel like this. Like you're like, I thought I trained my legs, I thought I, trained hard, right? So that is something to be aware of. But also, like, it is one of those things where it's kind of hard to really say, because there's actually mixed research on this in terms of what is more fatiguing. And it probably comes down to your actual background and, different things. For example, a few like research papers have shown that cycling is actually more fatiguing than running, right? And the reason is this is probably because people cycling pushed harder because it's actually way easier to push hard while cycling because for the exact same reason that Gary's talking about there is you only kind of have to do half the work. You're only kind of doing the concentric bit. You're not really doing the eccentric. Now I know like, actual cyclists will kind of cringe at that because
Yeah.
they don't just push down while they're doing the work. Like they're actually pulling up with the opposite leg. Like if you ever go on one of those like spin bikes, can't remember the name of them, but like this kind of spin bikes that have like the
Pedals.
ratio of how to you
Oh, yeah.
each of those things. Like it'll show you the kind of map. Like it'll show how much like pushing force you're doing and how much pulling force you're doing and the ratio between the two legs there. So that is something to be aware of, that like, it depends on your background what's going to be more fatiguing. Like if you're a competitive cyclist and you're like, okay, actually I use the pull on the bike as well, like I'm actually using my hamstring, etc., that's probably going to be a bit more fatiguing than someone who's just like pushing
Yeah.
down and letting the effectively the momentum carry the leg back up, right? So that is something to be aware of. Obviously it depends on what you have been doing, what you're adapted to, etc. etc. Right? But yeah, so that's kind of how we would integrate it. It's pretty straightforward. Now, me personally, I kind of like to just maximize the time interval that we're doing in terms of, look, if we got 10 minutes to do cardio at the end of our training, like I want to make that as intense as possible in terms of like the same way you would do with your resistance training. Like, let's say we have 3 sets to do in that 10 minutes. I want to make those 3 sets, hard, for the 30 seconds or whatever we're doing before we start just adding more volume. Because you wouldn't do that with your training volume, like we've discussed. You wouldn't just go, oh yeah, I did kind of 3 sloppy sets and like my performance was definitely decreased by the 3rd set. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to add another set. You wouldn't do that. You'd go, okay, let's actually maximize the 3 sets first before we start adding more, right? So that's the way you should also be thinking about this, and not just a case of like more is better, right? So that's generally how we would put all this stuff together. But I suppose this then kind of needs us to answer the question, is concurrent training going to be harmful to your gains then? Are you going to do this? What we've just suggested, do some background activity, do some maybe aerobic conditioning on a separate day, and then maybe add in some anaerobic conditioning at the end of your training sessions. Is that going to kill your gains, Gary?
Yeah, I would say it exists on a spectrum. Okay. So I think if you're a competitive bodybuilder, you need to think about this stuff a lot more, because surprisingly, a lot of competitive bodybuilders actually don't. Like, they'll do their cardio fasted, deliberately all of the time. And sometimes they're pushing quite hard, and kind of leaving out some of the key sports nutrition principles that they would apply if it was a weight training session. So I would say that, like, if you're doing cardio, as a bodybuilder, you need to be thinking, right, am I really digging into my recovery resources? Am I really pushing into catabolism here at a point where maybe I don't want to do that? Like, if you're dieting for fat loss, let's say, and you're doing a 1.5 hour leg session, and then you do an hour of cardio after that, and you didn't have any intra workout nutrition or anything, it would actually be wise during that cardio session to, start sipping on some carbohydrates, plus or minus some whey protein or essential amino acids or something, just to start to, minimize any effects that might kick in, because context always matters with the level of interference. And, while 30 minutes or an hour of cardio isn't going to have a significant interference and isolation, if performed after a leg session and you're using your legs again, and you're now delaying the refueling process, that might have a bit more of a significant effect. For the general population, I wouldn't even worry about it. It's just not that big a deal. But for that individual who's trying to maximize every ounce of muscle, that might matter a bit more. So for the most part, I think that I see very little interference very little interference between the muscle and cardiorespiratory adaptations in individuals who are just adding in a bit of cardio to try to improve their fitness. Like, most people are going to be doing something like maybe 30 minutes 3 times a week. Very few people do more than that. Some people might do up to kind of 150, 180, minutes per week, but it's quite rare, to be honest. And most people who do that, they're doing it at a relatively low intensity. So I just wouldn't be worried about it interfering. With that said, the main place where it is going to start to interfere more is when people are in that deficit, they're dieting, and they're trying to burn as many calories as they can rather than reducing their calories through nutrition. And what you end up doing here is that not only are you creating the deficit for your fat loss, but you're also creating an additional recovery deficit because you're doing so much activity. And this is especially the case where people start to do, as I said previously, where they go on the Stairmaster and they go on the incline treadmill, or they're cycling, they're hitting 160, 170, 180 beats per minute for 45 to 60 minutes every single day. Like, that's almost certainly going to interfere. But again, that's not what we're recommending. So don't do that, and you won't run into these issues, I think.
I would consider the issue one of under recovery for the vast majority of the reason people say, oh, there's a concurrent, training, like, it's harmful for your gains. Now, obviously, this goes up to a point, and that point is probably around, and we've discussed this before, and we've gone into figures and stuff, but it's probably around the point where your gastrointestinal system just can't absorb more food. And like, there's figures thrown around that's 1.5 times or 2 times your like basal metabolic rate or whatever. But there's probably a point where, you could eat more food, but it's actually not going to lead to better recovery overall. Like you're just at the limit of how much you can actually absorb, right? So it's probably, you can get up to that point, and then after that, you're not going to be able to out eat the recovery demands of this or out sleep it or whatever. So that's not what we're recommending. Like, again, we're not recommending you go out and do, a marathon training and 6 resistance training sessions. Like, that's obviously not going to be effective. Like, if you're just doing like minimal effective dose to still get results, again, we're saying like, 15 minutes max at the end of your resistance training session of anaerobic work, and you're saying you're training 4 days per week, like what's that, an hour extra of anaerobic work, like cardio work, and then we'll say you do an hour of aerobic work then on a Saturday or something. Like, realistically, if 2 hours of cardio across an entire week on top of 4 hours of resistance training is the thing that completely derails you, like we'll say that's literally 6 total hours of work. Like, there's probably something else going on, right? Because there's athletes out there, college athletes, student athletes, that have other stuff going on, and they're training 6 hours a day, So in my mind, I'm like, you either brought this intervention in too early, weren't adapted to it, weren't able to adapt to it in terms of the speed at which you brought it in, or you're not sleeping, you're not recovering, you're not eating well, your stress is too high, all these other things start coming into it. Because again, 6 hours of work throughout the week, that should be relatively easy to recover from if you're doing the general things we talk about, correctly. Right now, obviously, there's going to be certain populations that's going to be way too much work or whatever. But again, that's what all of this programming stuff is supposed to be about. It's about finding the effective doses for what you want. If you find yourself constantly not recovered, then we're doing too much. We need to pull it back, right? But that would be my perspective. Do you have anything else to add on to this, Gary, finally?
No, I think that covers everything. And like, I would just reiterate the point that we covered a lot more detail than this in the full cardio series. So do please refer back to that if you'd like more information, particularly on some of the more specifics around programming and different goals, etc. Because I think you will get a lot out of it. So that's it for me anyway.
100%. Now, Gary, wrap this up. Where can people find us, etc., etc.?
Yeah, so first and foremost, guys, as always, we do have some coaching spaces available. So if you'd like to work with a member of our coaching team, you can do so. Okay, we have the privilege of having a lot of different or multiple different coaches on the team now. So we're pretty much always available, or one of us is always available for coaching. So if you'd like to work with us, do get in touch. You can find information in the description box below, or you can reach out to us on Instagram or any other platform. Okay, so Instagram, as I said, Triage Method. You can follow along there. We're putting out a lot of content on Instagram, to be honest. Seems to be a pretty positive response. Lots of different topics. Again, because we have different people producing content now, we can have posts that are on nutrition, then other posts on training, posts on injury, posts on practical coaching stuff, etc. So lots of variation there, something there for everyone. So make sure you're following. And obviously, we all put out content ourselves as well on our personal Instagram pages. So if you go on to the Triage Method Instagram, click on who we're following, you'll see our respective coaches there, and you can see the content that everyone is putting out. So do follow along. We appreciate it. If you like the podcast, share it on your story. We always appreciate that. We'll repost it, or even just give us feedback personally. If you've got any topics, you can also request those. And if you happen to use a podcast platform that allows, you can leave a rating and review, and that is greatly appreciated. If you're a coach yourself, you're trying to support your education, you can subscribe to the Triage Method Coaches Corner and access our lectures on everything from anatomy to physiology to nutritional biochemistry and the practicals of nutrition. How many carbs should you eat? Why should you eat that? Well, not you, but for your clients primarily. How do you make these decisions? That's all covered in the Coaches Corner. So do take a look there if you're interested. And other than that, we've got our monthly newsletter, which will be going out in about a week's time again. So do subscribe and make sure you're not missing out on that. And I think that's everything.
100%. And what I would say is, for sure, definitely follow the YouTube channel. And if you watch this on YouTube,
Yes,
hit that follow button. And then also follow the Triage Method Instagram page, because that's what we're putting a lot of focus into over the next while, to really provide a lot of content. And it really does help if you do share that or like it or just save it or do any of the things that lead to better engagement, because then the algorithm picks it up and then we get boosted to a wider audience. So if you do like the podcast and you're kind of like, oh, like I don't want to pay for their services, or I don't want to do anything like that, literally hit a follow on Instagram, like the posts that you see, and that's enough for us. Like that helps us grow our business overall. So we appreciate that. Anyway, I have nothing else to say, Gary. Do you?
No, just das vidanya.
Fantastic. Anyway, enjoy the rest of your day, Gary. Enjoy the rest of your day, guys who are listening, and gals, I suppose.